Welcome everyone. This is Peter Wanders, President and CEO of Anderson Ranch. Welcome to our Virtual Art Salon with Chris Jordan. He will be in conversation with Andrea Jenkins-Wallace, the VP of Artistic Programs here at Anderson Ranch. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the difficult times we are facing as a nation and as compassionate people. Anderson Ranch wishes to reaffirm our values and our mission, our responsibility to be an inclusive community that values equality and the free exchange of ideas. And we commit to the work ahead of us as we try to better realize these goals. The core of Anderson Ranch's mission is to support individuals in all levels and abilities in the development of their artistic practice. Regardless of their medium, technique, message, backgrounds, all artists struggle daily to master their chosen tools and techniques and to create the outcomes they desire. Anderson Ranch aims to support this artistic growth and the impact that they can have to illuminate, enlighten, and create change. Like the artists we serve, Anderson Ranch is committed to finding new ways, new tools, and new techniques to achieve our vision of a better world. Our mission does not change, and we felt even in these troubled times, it was important to continue our programming while also looking for more effective ways to create change that we want to see in the world. Art is important. It's both personal and it's political, and that is true of our featured artists today as well. Andrea and Chris, I look forward to hearing from you and your program today. On behalf of Anderson Ranch, our staff, and our trustees, I thank all of you for joining us. Andrea, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you, Chris, for being here. We're really appreciative that you're able to do this with us this afternoon. I thought I would start, Chris, and I followed your work for a long time. And I know you've spent most of your life making work and dedicating most of your life in your work to injustices about the environment. And given what's happening today, I was thinking, I saw a quote that you said about your work and about issues that are important in the real world, that if they only exist in our mind as an abstract figure, we can't really comprehend them. And if we can't comprehend the issue, then we don't feel anything and we don't act. And that you're trying to create images that point toward comprehension of the issues so that we begin to feel something. So it's not just an intellectual exercise. So if we feel angry or sad or frightened, that is when we act decisively. And so I'm wondering if we can start the conversation today to kind of pull that together between the work that you're doing around the environment and also what's happening right now with protests around the country.
Well, thank you. That's a beautiful kind of way to lead off. And let me begin by saying something that really makes me feel a lot today, and that is Black Lives Matter. I stand in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters everywhere in our country and in our world right now. And I acknowledge my white privilege, and I want to learn how to be an ally to Black people everywhere. Wow, I didn't think I'd feel that much saying that, but I do. You know, all of my work for the longest time has been about this thing that I see in our world that is it's mostly pointed toward environmental issues, but I don't really think of myself as an environmental artist because I see like what I'm interested in doing is following a problem all the way to its source and solving it there, which is why I railed so much against those solutions to plastic in the ocean that are about going to the middle of the ocean and picking up the plastic. Like that's the very end of the problem. And I want to trace it back further and further and further, like following a river all the way up to the spring that it originates from. And that's the place where there's the most transformative power to change any problem in our world. And when you do that, you always end up here. That's where all of the problems in our world begin. And in that way, whether it's environmental degradation, the damage that's being done to our environment, or to our atmosphere through global climate change, or racism and all forms of social injustice, it's exactly the same thing that you get to here. It's this disconnect that is the kind of core sickness that humanity suffers from, and that's where I point all of my work. I think maybe I have some slides that I would love to share with you guys, so maybe I'll do my screen share thing here and show you guys what I'm up to. Let's see. Uh-oh, did it work?
Yes.
Oh yeah, there we go.
It's working. And Chris, I think I'll just let everyone know who's watching that if you have questions, you can definitely type them in the chat box, and I will definitely pull them up. And the Q&A, sorry, I've been corrected. So please type them in the Q&A box, and then I will actually go through them. And Chris, if you don't mind, if I can ask questions as you go along, that would be great.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's make this a real-time conversation.
Okay,
That's
great.
way better than me just kind of blabbing. Okay, so you guys probably, hopefully, have seen this photograph, and it's the only photo that I'm going to show from 25 years of work I've been doing so far, because I want to bring you all the way up to date and show you this project that I'm working on right now. And but here's a little bit of background. I'm really interested in trying to cut through the broken paradigm that we're all stuck in around environmentalism. And it really, whether you put environmentalism or social justice in there, they're interchangeable. Because what I see, but I'm going to focus it all on environmentalism for now, because that's really my area of expertise, is what I see is, for the longest time, we've all been in this paradigm of trying to terrify each other into action. And we all thought it's the right thing to do, to show all the bad news, how horrible all the mining is, and how horrible all of the graphs that are getting steeper and steeper, and we should all be alarmed and we should all be terrified. And it's sort of over like 10 years or 15 years or something like that, it has, that whole thing has amplified and amplified and amplified until now we literally have our leading activists advocating for panic, telling everybody we should all be panicked. And if you study panic, if you study brain science, I happen to be have a friend who's a brain scientist, and she says that when you're in a state of fear, your brain literally loses its capacity to think. The wiring becomes short-circuited so that you can have faster reflexes. And panic is the highest, the deepest form of fear. It's a state of complete, acute terror that renders the mind and the body incapacitated. And that's where we got to right before the pandemic, is a place where our leading activists are advocating for panic, and everywhere is this term, the apocalypse, the climate apocalypse. We're all just sort of using the word apocalypse, this horribly terrifying term, and this fear. We're just swimming in fear. And that's the message that's been put out there by environmentalists for many, many years now, all thinking it was the right thing to do. And what I'm trying to do with my new project, I'm making a new environmental film that is, I'm at least looking at how do you cut through that and frame a message in a different way that doesn't involve that kind of doomsday horror and alarmism. So here are a couple of slides to show you what I'm doing. I'm stuck on a bird again. This time, instead of albatrosses, it's flamingos, but really they're only one very small character in an unbelievably beautiful and amazing story that's happening here in the country of Chile. which is where I am at the moment. I'm sort of stuck here. I love being here, but I wasn't planning on being here this long. So for those of you who haven't hung out in Chile much, there's Chile. You see South America. Chile is that big brown line that goes along the west coast of sort of the bottom half of South America. And if you look right in the middle of your screen, you'll see a white spot, a white dot. And we're going to zoom in on that because that's right where we're close to where I've been working. That is a giant salt lake. And that one is actually in Bolivia. You can see the border of Chile. It's yellow just to the left of that giant lake. But there are many, many of those huge salt lakes in Chile. We call in here they're called salars, and they are incredibly magnificent and beautiful ecosystems. This is one I spent a bunch of time on. It's called Salar de Surire, and it's at 14,000 feet, and quite intense conditions out there. You can see just over that mountain on the left side is Bolivia. And the winds just come ripping over that mountain and onto this massive salt flat. And who lives in these incredibly beautiful places is the most elegant and mysterious and graceful and beautiful bird, the flamingos. And they literally freeze into the ice. The lake freezes every night. And the flamingos stand in the water and freeze. The water freezes around them until they can't move until around noon the next day when the lake thaws out again. And let's see. Oh yeah, there's another photograph. And by the way, all the photographs you're going to see are all multi-row panoramic images using a 100 megapixel camera. So I think this one was 19 by 3 wide. So they're absolutely massive images. When you zoom out, when you walk all the way up close to a large print, you'll be able to see the feathers on the flamingos. There's on a very still day reflected like a mirror. And then here's an image of the top is that same thing you just saw. And then the bottom is the sound of a flamingo. An audio recording of a flamingo from that spot calling to its mate. And I remember standing there and looking at that mountain thinking just the reflection, it looks like a sound wave. And and the skies here at night are just unbelievable. At 14,000 feet and with no civilization anywhere near, this place is completely empty. There are no tourists. It's virtually undeveloped, and the most absolutely massive, magnificent ecosystem. And this is a photograph of Venus setting on the western horizon in that same location. And then there's the central bulge of the Milky Way. Just the stars here are absolutely dazzling to the eyes at night. And there's another shot looking toward the north of the Milky Way as it dips down beyond the horizon. And here's what else is happening here. Most of the world's lithium happens to be in these salt flats. And lithium, you guys probably all know, you've heard of lithium ion batteries. Well, lithium, everybody thinks of lithium as being the green energy. And it's the compound that is in Tesla batteries and Prius batteries and all of our phones and all of our laptops and flashlights and Bluetooth, everything. It's all lithium, and it's one of the world's largest growing mining industries right now, and it's incredibly environmentally destructive. This is what it looks like. This used to be a salt lake, and it just turns into a complete wasteland, and it changes the chemistry of all the water all around it. And that's one of the things about the flamingos is their whole life is extremely sensitive to changes in the chemistry of the water that they live in. So,
So Chris, I guess one question that I have is this, when you're choosing places around the world to work or to make work, how do you choose that location? And did you choose Chile because of specifically about, you know, lithium, or was it the birds, or was it like what, the landscape, or what, how do you make those choices?
interesting question. The thing that I'm always kind of looking for is it's a story that contains layers and layers. It's like a kind of, and that was the thing that immediately drew me to Midway Island, to photograph and then make my film there, is not only was it a place where this tragedy is happening in the literal sense, but it's also a kind of poem. There's layers and layers of symbolism and poetry in the albatrosses there. And it's the same thing happening here in Chile. And I've been back and forth to Chile a few times, speaking at conferences and doing things like that. And I met the people who run an NGO here that is all about mining. And they invited me to come and to visit the Altiplano and see if I was interested in making a film. And I got out there and we began exploring both the destruction of the lithium mining and just the just the astonishing beauty of this massive, empty, wild, silent landscape that has as many creatures as the African savanna. I mean, when you get up on a mountain and look out over one of these areas, it's just unbelievable number of living beings. And we're filming them and photographing them with batteries that contain lithium from that place. And it
Ironic.
Yeah, it's far more than irony. It's being in this totally inescapable paradox. And that's what with this project, is what I'm doing is just going further and further into that paradox, because I think it's so time right now to get past both the kind of alarmist doomsday messaging, but also the finger pointing. And that's something for a long time that I've avoided doing in my work, even though I think of myself as an activist. I don't want to point any fingers because I'm not in a position to point a finger. And for a really long time, I've experienced the irony of all of consumers, all of us individual people who consume. If you ask somebody, what's the biggest environmental problem in the world? They'll all say bad corporations, bad oil companies, as they get in their gas guzzling SUV and go driving on a road trip. Bad computer companies, as they buy the newest Apple computer and then have the newest phone. It's like we've all been doing that, and I'm no exception. And we've seen a really interesting thing during this pandemic is all of the planes are on the ground now. And we're releasing far, far less carbon into the atmosphere than we have for like 75 years. And none of it was because corporations did anything. Mm. It was because the demand decreased. Mm-hmm. And so it actually turns out that what the corporations were saying all that time, which is, we're just providing a service for you, mm-hmm. was true. And that's a really interesting thing when you go to these mines, these lithium mines in Chile, and you talk to the guys, they're proud of what they do. They're like logistics guys. They're thinking like, how many trucks can we move, and how much gas are we going to need, and how much water are we going to need, and like they're solving this giant puzzle to figure out how they can get as much lithium out to the market as possible, and they're super proud of their job. They don't think of themselves as the bad guys at all, and they shouldn't. They're no more the bad guys than I'm the bad guy who buys the camera powered by the batteries that contain the lithium from that place. So I really believe it's time to get past the whole paradigm of pointing fingers and to look at what is in here that is kind of the headwaters of this whole problem, which is our runaway consumer culture, and the disconnection that is kind of the sickness that we all suffer from.
Earlier today, or earlier, I think yesterday when we spoke, you talked about often you get questions about, well, you know, especially with the early work that you made around plastics and consumerism and the multiplicity and the numbers. You said, you know, I often get questions about like, well, what's the best way to reduce plastic in my community? And you said, that's the least of what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is really what's going on collectively here around, you know, the choices we're all making collectively, even at the expense of our environment. So I wonder, as you're making images as a photographer and an artist, and also the images that I've been seeing more recently, you know, they're very beautiful and very seductive. And so as you document, you know, those kinds of things, how do you balance, you know, the seductive, beautiful photograph with the reality of what you're photographing and the messaging you're trying to get across?
Yeah, that's exactly the heart of the paradox that I'm in with this project. And I just changed my slides. So the Altiplano is this absolutely vast, wide landscape. And when you look up close anywhere, you find so much life. Look at these tiny little flowers. They're like 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters in size. You don't even see them until you go all the way down and look closely at the ground. And there I am with a macro lens taking that, a video of that. But to answer your question, like, here's one thing that we know, I think, is we can't turn away from the darkness. We can't turn away from the bad news. We've been amplifying it and even exaggerating it. I see a lot of exaggeration going on in the environmental activism world, like how much plastic is going into the ocean is vastly exaggerated. So we cannot exaggerate and not amplify terror, but we do have to stay focused on the problems. So I'm not advocating turning away from the problems, but we also, I think we all sense that looking only at the problem doesn't motivate us. Mm-hmm. It's not inspiring to just hear like, oh, everything's terrible and getting worse. And I think the missing piece, part of the disconnect that we all suffer from, is that we are forgetting, or we have forgotten, something so basic and so simple that it's the most obvious thing. And so we forget it, which is the beauty of our world. The incomprehensibly amazing miracle that we're all a part of. And that, I think, I'm sort of right now on a mission to reanimate nature photography as a legitimate and relevant art form. Because it's had a really bad reputation and just been trampled on for such a long time by a lot of people who really aren't, who are making it more of an ego exercise than actually an exercise in reverence. But the natural world out there it's not all destroyed. And what is there, the living world, is so amazingly beautiful. And there's no medium more suited than photography to remind us of this miracle, the miracle of the living world that we are all a part of. And so what I'm doing with this new project is facing the darkness and just remembering that's not the whole story. There are also huge sections of this vast wilderness that are virtually untouched by humans, where the ecosystem is intact. Huge numbers of wild creatures are free and doing really well, all the way up to the apex predators. There's lots of mountain lions back there in those shadows. And to hold those two things together in a kind of balance. And I think if we could collectively achieve that state of remembering to be in a state of reverence and love for the living world, then we can collectively decide, yeah, we do want lithium, but we don't need so much of it, and we're willing to pay a little more maybe, so that the lithium mining company can use best practices to minimize their effect. And I think that's kind of the paradigm that we have to adopt going forward from the point of view of environmentalism.
Do you think that, I guess, do you think that's possible? And I say that just because I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that. Like, is it possible to collectively shift and find all of us to find reverence by showing the beauty as opposed to, being motivated by fear that this is the end? Or even, like, I think of the earlier projects where numbers, like, you would show, this is 200, I'm making this number up, but this is like 250,000 cell phones, and this is what's dumped every day, or, those kinds of things that you were doing earlier. Did you move from that messaging, visualizing that, so people could actually visualize what does that look like for the amount of things being consumed and wasted, to let's move back to the landscape and the beauty of it? Was that a conscious shift because you felt like that messaging wasn't working? Or you just really needed, even for your own soul and spirit, to reconnect with nature and the landscape in a different way?
Oh, I love your questions. I wish this could go on much longer. Well, that shift is something that happened to me as part of my project on Midway Island. Because I originally went to Midway fully immersed in that sort of bad news paradigm.
Could you just mention what Midway is, just for those people who aren't familiar with that project, just briefly what that was?
Yeah, good idea. Midway it's a tiny island in the very middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it's the place where the Battle of Midway happened in World War II. And it has the interesting distinction of being the place that is the furthest from a continent of anywhere on Earth. So it's 3,000 miles from the west coast of the US out to this tiny island, and then 3,000 miles from that island all the way across to Asia. It's exactly in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And on that island are tens of thousands of albatrosses, baby albatrosses, whose bodies are filled with plastic. And if you've seen those photographs of birds whose bodies are filled with plastic, those are the photographs that I took out on that island. And I spent 8 years going back and forth to the island and photographing it and filming it. And when I first went there, I only was interested in photographing the dead birds filled with plastic. It was like the most bad news possible photography project. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I had been a couple of times that I started to really see the beauty of the place and experience the beauty of the live birds, and realize that there's this tremendous opportunity to take a lesson from the name of the island, Midway, to stand midway between horror and beauty, between all of the mistakes of our past and the still unwritten story of our future, and to take a position that stands between those things and holds them in a kind of balance. And in doing that, I noticed that despite the environmental movement's kind of constant focus on bad news and horror and catastrophe and collapse and so on, the kind of constantly stoking public terror, I noticed in my own therapy process, there's no therapist in the world that will tell you that the way to heal, the way to grow is through self-hatred, is through shame and amplifying shame and fear. And there's no spiritual teacher in the world either who will tell you that that's a healthy way toward anything positive. And yet, kind of shaming and blaming and finger pointing and amplifying terror are the heart of the environmental paradigm, environmentalist paradigm. And I don't mean to blame anybody for having been that way, because I was that way as well. And it's just one of those things that you wake up to one day and say, oh, wow, we've all gotten into this habit. And it's now that we see it, we can make a conscious choice to do something different if we want to. Mm-hmm. And I think it is time now to use the power of photography to turn toward the beauty of our world and celebrate beauty. But here's an interesting piece of it, is to celebrate the beauty that's out there, not to create beauty. And here's what I mean by that. There are a lot of photographers who think of photography as being a thing where you take something and you make it into an artwork. And Ansel Adams is kind of the king of that. And he said many times in his life that he thinks of a photograph as being an artistic masterpiece. That's what he wants to create, is an artistic masterpiece. And I think that's kind of where nature photography got stuck. And maybe that's exactly why there has been so much really bad nature photography and why it has such a bad name is, this is a different approach that I'm taking, is I don't think of myself as an artist. I'm not trying to create art. I think of myself as a documentary photographer. And all I want to do when I stand in front of a scene like the one you're looking at there, just this incredibly fantastic swirling pattern of mountains, I don't want to create something where you look at it and you think, ooh, what a great artwork by Chris Jordan. Mm. Ooh, he's such a clever, he juxtaposed this against that. What I want to do is use photography as a window, as a clean, clear window to create something that you can come and stand in the same place where I stood and just behold the magnificence of the subject, whatever that thing is. Like, look at that blast crater in a volcano. That's a volcanic crater. And it never rains out here. There's no moisture out in the desert here. And the reason that those yellow grasses are able to survive and grow is just because that's where the cooler, slightly more moist air tends to settle at night. And so as I look out into the natural world, what I want to do is to simply see it with reverence. But I'm trying to add as little as possible. I don't want to add something or interpret it or make it into something that you look at and talk about art or me. And of course I'm interpreting. It's impossible to take a photograph that's completely objective. We all know that. But at least as much as possible, I want to create a kind of altar, a sacred altar to the beauty of a particular subject. And And that's my wish, is to reanimate nature photography as a way of remembering this profoundly important thing that we are collectively forgetting.
Chris, there's a question here by Michael Krieger, and he says, or he asks that, he agrees that nature is beautiful, but I guess the question is, in a way, isn't there also a danger in putting back under the bell jar and suggesting that it exists in a separate world, because then it's always idealized?
Oh, yeah, it's so interesting. And that's a part of the paradox, or the whatever you call it, the intellectual challenge of doing nature photography right now, is we don't want to live in denial of all the bad news. But I want to tell you a story that happened to me that was kind of transformative, and that is, last year I got to spend 3 months in the American desert photographing. I went on an extended trip, and it was I was planning on spending most of it in Utah, but I took a side trail into Nevada pretty early on, and then spent like a month and a half exploring every corner of Nevada. And I fell so in love with Nevada. And I got to go see a whole lot of the places that Richard Misrach spent a large part of his career photographing. And Richard Misrach is my highest level, what did I call him? My not my mentor, but someone who I have the absolutely highest respect for as a photographic artist. And when I went to these places, what I was expecting to see was what I've always seen in all of Richard Misrach's photographs, which is horrible destruction. And it was really interesting to be in Nevada and drive along a 50-mile dirt road toward the place where the destruction is. And as I'm driving, literally millions of songbirds are erupting from the bushes next to the road when I'm driving. Because Nevada has almost no commercial agriculture, and so there's almost no commercial pesticide use. And so Nevada has a healthy insect population. And so in those, what look like huge empty deserts in Nevada, are billions, I mean, hundreds of billions of insects, butterflies and other insects, and songbirds eat them. And so the songbird population in there is absolutely massive, like more birds than I've seen anywhere in my life, anywhere. And that is an actual thing that's real in Nevada. And so if we only go photograph the sloppy, horrible area where somebody dumped oil, we're ignoring the good news. And what I'm doing at the moment is photographing the beauty. Mm-hmm. I did a whole project in Nevada where I photographed those kind of subjects.
Chris, I'm kind of watching the clock, and I want to open it up to more people asking questions, but kind of one other question thought I had as I was thinking about what you're talking about, this work, and also what's happening in the world right now, or in the United States. And something I think about is grief. Yeah. And I know that you've talked a lot about grief, and I think maybe that's what a lot of people are feeling just in general. There's anger, there's grief, around COVID, and grief with what's happening with the protests, and grief is, in terms of people not thinking or being white privilege, and everything that's happening with the protests. And I think that, I wonder if you could talk about that, about grief and its duality in terms of your work, and maybe even politically in the climate of what's happening right now in the world.
Yeah. It's such an important subject. Well, grief, and I happen to be right just moving through a period of super deep grief in my own personal life, because there was the end of my sweet canine companion's life just a few days ago, who was with me for 14 years. So I've been immersed in the healing waters of grief in a very personal way just the last couple of days. And here's the thing about grief is I was always taught when I was young that grief is bad. It's like a bad feeling. And so if we feel grief, then we should like get over it and just sort of push it away. Get over it as fast as possible and not invite it or not think of it as something that we want to bring in and really go deep with. And I think as a culture, we do that. We're grief averse.
Yeah.
And here's the thing about grief. This is the thing that I learned in on Midway Island. That was truly a turning point in my life. Is I discovered that grief is not the same as sadness or despair. And that's the mistake we make, is thinking that grief is sadness. It's just sad. But anyone who has lost someone that they love, and anyone who's grieved involuntarily from a loss like that, knows that it's sort of like a triangle. There is sadness. Grief does contain sadness, and it also contains love, and it contains beauty. And the further you go into grief, whether it's environmental grief or grief for the loss of a loved one, or the grief for all that is being lost in our world right now, the more you end up swimming in this feeling that you can't say that it's good or bad. It's incredibly powerful. It's transformationally powerful. But you can't say that it's a good or bad feeling. You can sort of let go of the judgment that it's bad. And it brings us powerfully into our experience, into our body and into the present. And it connects us with what we love, because at its heart, that's what grief is. It's the love that we feel for someone or something that we love that we're losing or who is suffering. Mm-hmm. That's what grief is. It's the same as love. Grief is not the same as sadness. Grief is the same as love. Mm-hmm. And when we hold grief away, when we are averse to grief, then we have also separated ourselves from our essential state of being, which is the love that we're made of, is now over there. And that's the doorway we step through when we grieve. It's the doorway that leads home. It brings us home to the deep, the ocean of love that we each contain. And in that place, then we have access to our wisdom and compassion. And that's what all of my work is aimed at, is getting back to that place. It's not really here. It's sort of both here and here, because my belief is if we could achieve this collectively, if we could, it's a spiritual awakening is what it would be. That's what it is to reconnect with love. It's a spiritual experience. I don't mean religious. It's so deep that it affects you all the way to the marrow of your bones.
Right. It's human.
And if we could achieve this collectively, then we would step into a new world together.
Hopefully that will start to happen. Chris, we have a question from Charlotte Renault. How do you personally connect to the natural world when you're not looking through a lens?
Ooh, good one. That's an issue for me. because the way I photograph, I tend to photograph sort of expedition style, because I have this huge medium format like rig that I gotta schlep and multiple tripods and all that stuff. So I don't go photographing like every day. And I connect so much through the lens. And I want to make more of a practice of just being in nature. And where I am here in Chile, I happen to be living right on this incredibly beautiful lake. And I go walking on the lake a lot. I've been taking my shoes off and walking into the super freezing water and just standing in the cold water and looking at this magnificently beautiful lake. But I totally feel that question. There's something about photographing that makes me look harder and slow down and be there more deeply, that I really cherish.
I'm going to circle back again to our conversation about grief. And there's a question or comment from Jean Golden, and she agrees that we are a grief-averse culture, yet nature, in a way, is grief-averse as well. And she talks about thinking about all the lives that are lost on battlefields throughout history, and then the miracle of the beauty of nature, which covers it up as the battlefields, you know, with beauty of grass, flowers, trees, and so forth. And I think about that in terms of like, what does a landscape hold? What's beneath? What is the memory? What kind of memories does a landscape hold? Do you think about that when you're photographing the landscape? Because I often think about this idea of like the landscape being a space, but it's not a place until there's a memory associated with it. And, you know, different groups of people have different kinds of memories associated with different places, you know, and then, you know, so I think of it one way, you may think of it another way. And I'm wondering if that comes into you thinking about space and place and landscape.
I'm always fascinated to read the work of people who think of the landscape that way. My friend Shubhankar Banerjee, who did that amazing work in the Arctic, always spoke about the sense of place, and guys like Mark Klett, you know,
Well, yeah, Mark, for sure.
So many photographers who think of the sense of place and work with that kind of memory. I don't think about that at all when I'm out there in a landscape. Like this scene, what I'm seeing right here is when I'm looking through my lens or when I'm just standing there beholding it, I'm seeing a psychedelic explosion of incredible color. And this, from a very, I think I maybe have a pretty scientific eye, because I'm thinking of all of the life forms. Like if you look way off to near the upper left, there's all that yellow. Every single one of those things is a single blade of yellow grass, like billions of blades of yellow grass. And incomprehensibly massive numbers of plankton that live at 14,000 feet. Just the same kind of plankton that live in the ocean, because this is salt water here at 14,000 feet, that make the water the color that it is. That's what I'm seeing is like the biology of it, the incredible multi-scalar biology. And I'm also thinking of time. Like that's a volcano. And being in the Altiplano in Chile, there are the incredible numbers of volcanoes. Like you can stand in one place and count like 200 volcanoes. And just imagining the roiling cauldron that it must have been some number of millions of years ago. And that's what I'm seeing is sort of like, I always imagined that I see the world the way an alien would. Like if an alien came and landed, they would just be like, wow, look how gorgeous. But I'm not thinking of it in human terms, in terms of like memory or meaning. It's more just the sheer existence, like the visual existence of this place.
Chris, we have about 10 minutes left. I have a couple more questions, and maybe you can, if you want to go through some more images. There is someone asking, how do you feel about collaboration? And is it something you're interested in? Why yes or no, or tell us about it.
Oh, I love collaborating. My Midway project there was a lot of collaboration on different levels there. And now I'm making a new film here in Chile that's going to be about what we're looking at here, the gorgeousness of the Altiplano and the destruction of the lithium mining. And I'm already collaborating with several other cinematographers. They came with me on this trip. And also I'm taking on the music for this film. And I'm discovering that there are an amazing number of really good Chilean jazz artists and hip hop artists. And there's just a vibe here in Chile. There's a vibe of collaboration that I really love. And so, yeah, this is going to be a project that a lot of people contribute to.
Great. One more question. And let's see. This is from Michael Krieger again. And he basically just says that he's really identifying with your work and your thoughts about grief. And what are your thoughts about the idea of the contemporary landscape, which this is, as a kind of memorial?
Oh. Wow. Well, that really got me. Yeah. That's one of the things that happens when you really appreciate the landscape, is you can't help but imagine the way it used to be. And the places where it is untouched are few and far between in the world. Chile happens to be. But every time I go to an old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm from, and these little postage stamp sized pieces of the old growth that are still there among miles and miles and miles of clear cut and replanting, I feel a tremendous amount of grief, because it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think, like when you're in Seattle, there's all the highways and freeways and malls and etc. It was all old growth forest. And when you stand in an old growth forest and really take in the unbelievable complexity and know what we know about what's happening inside every cell and what's happening with the mushroom mycelium down below the soil, all of the organisms that are collaborating and contributing and communicating with each other. The old growth forest is like a civilization from the most mind-blowing sci-fi movie. And everywhere in the world, it looked like that. And here in the Altiplano, that this is one place where it still looks pretty much the way it did a very long time ago.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I really hope we can see you at the ranch in person soon.
Oh, I have been jonesing. And by the way, the last thing I wanted to say is for those who are watching, I'm easy to find on Facebook. If you want to continue the conversation and with the ranch, yeah, invite me.
You're invited. Done.
Okay.
Done. And just for everyone to know, our next art salon will be next Tuesday. Michael Krieger will be speaking on June 9th at 4 p.m. And all of our virtual events are added to our YouTube channel and our website. And coming up, we have a Thinker Thursday on June 18th, so please join us for that. And again, our online workshops are filling up fast, so please check out our website and you can sign up. Thank you again, Chris, and hopefully we'll see everyone next week. Thank you.
Cheers, you guys. Ciao.
Bye.
Be safe.